Okay, I'd like to continue our discussion of evolution, and I want to come back briefly to natural selection. There's a couple of things I want to mention there and some terms that are related to that. And first is that, as we already established, what distinguishes natural selection is that it leads to differential reproductive success, and that leads to genetic change in a population over time, and also that it's not truly random. But there are a couple of terms that we always hear related to evolution, and I want to mention these. And one is the idea of fitness, Darwinian fitness or evolutionary fitness. And the idea behind fitness is that individuals that are more fit will have a greater reproductive success. So Darwinian fitness has nothing to do with being fast or strong or any of those kinds of things. It all has to do with reproductive success. So those that produce the most offspring, and we would consider these to be viable offspring that have the same general characteristics as the parents, they would be the most fit in a Darwinian definition or evolutionary definition of fitness. And then also the concept of adaptation. The most fit individuals we consider to be the most adapted to their particular habitat. So adaptation is really evolution. It's a type of evolution that makes organisms more fit. So adaptation and evolution really, in a sense, are synonyms, but it has this relationship to fitness. Okay, now continuing our look at the forces of evolution, and and continuing this idea, we've talked about inheritance, random genetic change or mutation, natural selection. Again, these are all demonstrable. These are all real ideas and concepts. And I want to continue that now looking at another force of evolution, which is genetic drift. So genetic drift is another process that is a random process. So I think that's an important thing to understand, and that's really the hallmark of genetic drift. So if we were looking at a population again, let's say we have a very small population of two individuals that are heterozygotes. It would be possible that these individuals could have an offspring that's homozygous recessive. If we go back to our Mendelian genetics, I hope you know that that's certainly possible. And let's say that they have a second offspring that's homozygous recessive. And let's say they have a third offspring that's homozygous recessive. And then let's say something happens to the parents. Now we have a rapid change in the allelic frequency of the population. And again, they may establish new individuals in this population. So what's happened here is that there has been genetic change in a population, but as long as that was a random process, in other words, the fact that the parents had offspring that are homozygous recessive, that wasn't a process of selection. Nature wasn't necessarily selecting for homozygous recessive individuals. It's just that the parents had homozygous recessive offspring. That was one of the possibilities. So as long as the parents didn't die because of some selective pressure, if it was just purely random or purely accidental that they disappear in this particular example, then that would be genetic drift. So the idea behind genetic drift is that allelic frequencies just change through random processes. They drift from what they were to new allelic frequencies by random processes, not through selection. So this usually happens in very small populations. And again, the key to being genetic drift, though, is that it's the result of random processes, not selection. All right. So again, this population, as long as there are only recessive alleles there, that's all that population would have over time. Okay, so let's look at a couple of examples of how we can see genetic change in a population that's usually attributed to, or often attributed to, genetic drift, but doesn't have to be affiliated with genetic drift. And so one of these is what we call founder effect. So we see this a lot of times with island population or islands off of a mainland. And so let's say we have a population with quite a bit of genetic diversity here. And what happens is that some individuals get to the island. And let's say that these individuals do not reflect the genetic diversity of the mainland population, and they establish a small population there. Now, this is an example of genetic drift, where we have a population being established that's different from the initial population. And again, it's called founder effect because they're founding a new population on this island. Now, again, what's important to understand is that that would only be genetic drift if the individuals got to this island just through purely random processes, if they were lucky. But if they had some selective advantage, In other words, that they were better swimmers. If they just outcompeted the others and got to the island, that would not be genetic drift. That would be natural selection. So founder effect doesn't have to be genetic drift. It can be genetic drift, but it could also be natural selection if there's some genetic advantage that's causing the founding of the new population. And that's the dilemma a lot of times. We, as biologists are looking at it and trying to figure out, well, how did they get there? Was it just luck, or was it due to some selective advantage? Okay, another example is a bottleneck. And so this is where you have a large population, and for some reason the population shrinks and then may eventually establish a larger population. And again, the survivors in the new population do not necessarily reflect the genetic diversity of the original population. So we refer to this again as a bottleneck. Now, again, that can be genetic drift if the individuals surviving are surviving just through luck. They happen to be in the right place, right time, and they survive when others die. But if they're surviving because they have some genetic advantage, some selective advantage, in other words, if there's an epidemic and they have a better immune system and that's why they survive, that would not be genetic drift. That would be natural selection. Okay, so again, let's look at an example here. So let's say we have some kind of a population. Individuals die, the population crashes. Some individuals survive, and they do not reflect the genetic diversity of the original population, and they may even reestablish the population, but the allelic frequencies are different from what we started with. That's an example of a bottleneck. So again, bottlenecks can be genetic drift, but it could also be natural selection. Now, again, there are several instances of bottlenecks in the Yellowstone ecosystem. One example would be the grouse populations. This is a blue grouse, but there's also the sage grouse. There are only about 200 sage grouse in the Teton ecosystem of the Yellowstone ecosystem, and so that's an example of a bottleneck. We're not sure if they're going to reestablish larger populations or not. Also, the grizzly population bottleneck several years ago when we closed the dumps to feeding of grizzlies. So it got down to about 200 individuals or so. We think now that there are about 600 individuals in that ecosystem, but again, that's another example of a bottleneck. So again, founder effect or bottleneck, if it's due to some genetic advantage, that's natural selection and not genetic drift. So it's important to understand that difference. Okay, now another factor that can affect the genetic makeup of populations is migration. So in other words, you can have a particular population that's isolated from another population, again, within the same species, but different variants of the same species. And for some reason, individuals migrate from one area to another, then they bring in new genes to that area, and that can change the genetic makeup of that population, change the allelic frequencies in that population. So migration can be significant. Again, within the Yellowstone ecosystem, we do have marginal migrations that occur where this can be an impact. There's kind of a separation between the northern elk and bison herds and the southern elk and bison herds. Bison really don't make it across kind of the mountain range in between those two areas, but occasionally you will see elk migrating. And a couple of summers ago, it was kind of interesting where we saw a whole group of elk in some of the really high mountains of the Yellowstone ecosystem, making their way south. So there is a little bit of gene exchange between the two populations, but not a lot. Now, speciation then. As we look at evolution then, we've talked about all of these forces. Again, the fact that there's a common ancestry of organisms is unquestioned. But as we look at the forces then that can create variation within a species, how does that lead to new species? So let's look at some of the types of speciation that we observe in nature. To do this, we need to more or less define what is meant by a biological species. We consider a biological species to be like organisms, and generally by that we mean interbreeding organisms. And so that may be due to a geographical separation sometimes where there's distinct morphological types. We may consider those biological species, but for the most part, we're talking about whether they will breed with one another or not. And so again, as long as they're interbreeding, we generally consider that the same biological species. And as part of that, then they have to produce what we call viable young, and by that we mean offspring that are fertile, fully fertile offspring. So if you're going to have speciation, if you're going to have new species developing, then it requires genetic isolation. Okay, so we need species to be separated somehow so that they do not breed. And there's a couple of ways that we look at this. So again, if we have populations that will not breed with one another, at that point we would consider them different species. So isolating mechanisms keep species from breeding or keep individuals from breeding with one another. And there are two types of isolating mechanisms. One of these are what we call pre-mating or prezygotic isolating mechanisms. And this is where organisms just are not interested in one another. They do not want to copulate with one another. They don't want to mate with one another for whatever reasons. So in other words, if you go to the Yellowstone ecosystem and you see bighorn sheep, I don't think you're going to be sexually attracted to them. I hope not, even though they're very beautiful. But they will be attracted to other bighorn sheep. So that's what defines their species from our species. Same thing, if a deer and a bighorn sheep look at each other, they look at each other and say, we are just not the same thing. They don't secrete the same kind of hormones. They don't attract one another. They don't copulate with one another. So those would be pre-mating isolating mechanisms. Now, post-mating isolating mechanisms or post-zygotic isolating mechanisms are those where the organisms still think they're the same thing. They will copulate, they will attempt to breed, but it's the genes, the chromosomes that say, you're no longer the same thing. I can't make a viable offspring from your sperm and your egg. And I guess the classic example here would be a mule. If you take a horse and a donkey, they think they're the same thing. They will breed with one another. And they can produce a living offspring, which would be the mule. But the mule is not a viable offspring. The mule is a sterile offspring. So here's, again, a situation where the mule, the horse and the donkey say, yes, we're the same organism. But the chromosomes and genes say, you know what? You're not the same organism. I can't make a viable offspring from you. Now, we can sometimes influence populations to break down these species barriers. So for example, if you look at macaws, there's a type of macaw called a blue and gold macaw. They're scarlet macaws. In the wild, they do not interbreed. They have different behaviors. They're really kind of different animals, very different colorations and so on. And so in the wilds of South America, they do not interbreed with one another. Yet, under certain conditions, in breeding conditions, if you were to raise them together, especially if you take a young blue and gold and a young scarlet macaw, put them together, they can imprint on one another. And under certain conditions, you can get them to produce a hybrid. It's called a Catalina macaw. And that Catalina macaw will breed with each other. They are fertile. And they'll also breed back to the parental types. So again, where we define species and how we define species, we may have a certain definition for that, but sometimes the organisms don't read the book. They kind of do their own thing. So what this is telling us, though, or what they're saying to one another, is that, yeah, we're diverging. You know, we're speciating. We're in the process of speciating. We don't think we're the same things, yet genetically we're actually close enough that we can produce a viable offspring. But in the wild, since they have separated themselves, we would consider these separate species, even though the biological potential is there for a hybrid. So again, biologically, we would define these as separate species. Another example of where our definition breaks down a little bit and is hard to define where to draw the line as to whether we have a new species or not, but it also illustrates a speciation event, and it illustrates how speciation can occur. It occurs with a genus of salamander, the Incentina salamander, that we find here in California. And so as we look at this as representing the Central Valley, there are several, what we define as species, but let's just say at least subtypes of this Incentina salamander living around the Central Valley. So here in Southern California, we have a variety known as Schultzi, and it will interbreed with Xanthopica where their ranges meet. And then as you continue north, there's a species Oregonensis, or some subtype Oregonensis, and the Xanthopica will interbreed with them where their ranges interbreed. Oregonensis is found up in Northern California up into Oregon, but it also on the northern end of the Central Valley will encounter a variety known as Platensis, and they will interbreed where their ranges overlap. Platensis will interbreed on the east side of the valley with Crockeater, where their ranges overlap rather. And then Crockeater continues into Southern California, where it ranges overlap with a variety known as Clawberry. They will interbreed. But what's kind of interesting is that here in San Diego County, where Schultze and Kleberry's ranges overlap, they do not interbreed. They look at each other and say, we're not the same thing anymore. So what we actually think happened here is that we actually had a physical radiation around the Central Valley, and as they have continued to evolve, they've evolved to the point where they just aren't the same thing anymore, yet along the way, the different varieties think that they are the same thing. So again, what do we do? Are each of these different species? They're all different morphological types. We generally consider them that. But the important thing is that in an evolutionary sense, what's happened is that we've had enough genetic change through mutation, natural selection, other forces, that they eventually have become different things. Enough genetic change over time has occurred that a speciation event has occurred. Okay, so as we look at speciation events, we generally consider there to be three major ways in which species are produced. And one of these is allopatric speciation. And so allopatric, the prefix allo means different. Patric is a reference to country, as in patriot. And so this is where we actually have a physical separation of populations. So for whatever reason, perhaps an island is broken off of a continent, or perhaps a mountain range builds up and separates populations over time. But the point is that we get separation of populations, physical separation. When you have that physical separation, then you no longer can have interbreeding between the populations. And so mutation, natural selection, genetic drift, and other factors then work on the populations, and they will not necessarily work in the same way because, again, many of these processes are random. So the populations change over time based on these forces, mutation, natural selection, and so on, to the point that they may not be the same thing anymore. Even if they get the opportunity to interbreed, they may now look at each other and say, we're not the same thing anymore, or their genes may say, you're not the same thing anymore. So again, in allopatric speciation, the key is physical separation. That separates them so that there's no longer gene flow, and then mutation, natural selection, and so on changes them enough that they are just not the same organisms over time. And we think that this is the primary way that species are generated in nature, especially among animals. And another example here is that sometimes you'll have populations that may be together at certain times of the year and then separate and go into different places when they breed. Again, this is true of particularly the elk populations. They will come together in the winter. They may share winter feeding grounds, but they may actually then migrate in the summer to different regions of the park. And so these populations also, this would also, I think, fit into an allopatric speciation event, because when they're breeding, they're actually breeding in different isolated populations. They're not really spending time together. So this group would breed with one another, this group would breed with one another, and they don't breed when they're together in the winter ground. So even though they do spend part of the year together, I would consider this an allopatric speciation because although they haven't speciated yet, but it's physically separating them, and we'll see what happens over time. But it does create some subvarieties and genetically distinct groups of animals within the Yellowstone ecosystem. Now another type of speciation would be sympatric speciation. So sympatric speciation occurs when a species is generated within the same physical environment. This is rare in animals. It's much more common in plants. We don't think it's that uncommon in plants. And an example of this involves a sunflower in Utah. Helianthus is the genus here. And there are three varieties or species that have been encountered in the Utah desert. So there are these three varieties of sunflowers. And so a variety A, we'll just call them variety A, B, and C, or species A, B, and C. And so it was long supposed that this type A and type B of Helianthus had at some point interbred and produced this variety C, because when you look at variety C, it has characteristics that are intermediate between these two types. But in nature, this variety C cannot breed back to either parent, and so anyway, this is what was suggested. Also, when you looked at genetic evidence, there are genes that are shared in this variety C that you find in both type A and B. So again, we had the genetic evidence that this was a speciation event, but there were some researchers at the University of Utah that wanted to test this idea out. And so they actually went ahead and grew fields of species A and species B. And a few of them did actually interbreed and produce this variety C that would not breed back to either parent, but would breed with themselves. And I think what's also really remarkable is that this artificially generated variety C was not only genetically identical to what we found in nature, but also would interbreed with the natural variety that we found in nature of this type C. So this was actually a duplication of a speciation event that we see in nature. And again, just actually duplicated what we see out there in the Utah desert. So again, it was a slam dunk verification that speciation can occur and that we actually could do it in this case. Another place where we see this are in a lot of lakes. When you look in lakes, sometimes fish will kind of stratify within lakes. And there's a lake, for example, in I believe this is in Africa, where there's a variety of fish. There's kind of a bluish coloration and a reddish coloration. And the blue variety will preferentially mate with the blue variety. The red variety preferentially mates with the red variety. And although they haven't completely speciated here, we are looking at this kind of a transition from an isolation within the same ecosystem. So this is an example where we see this kind of thing occurring in animals. But again, we think it's more common in plants. And then still another type of speciation event would be what we call parapatric speciation. So parapatric speciation is where we have a speciation event in an adjacent geographical region. And so a lot of times this is the result of where you have what we call a cline, a very abrupt difference between one habitat or ecosystem and another ecosystem. And again, we think this is a little more common in plants, but one of the places we've seen this involve some variety of plants in tailing fields. This was first observed in some tailing fields in England. And a tailing field is produced as a product of mining. And so in England, what they had were these lead mines. And basically the lead ore is harvested, it's crushed, it's processed, and then you end up with this material that has to be disposed of that's called tailings. And so the tailings will be also high in lead, and those have to be dumped somewhere. And so in these tailing fields, in this case, lead is very toxic, not only to animals, but also plants. And so you had areas where plants were growing in the natural habitat, but they were not growing in the tailing fields because of the toxicity. Anyway, what happened was that some plants had a mutation that allowed them to tolerate the lead. And so they began to appear in these tailing fields. So they migrated into these tailing fields. And that really isn't the speciation event, but what the secondary event was that also there was another mutation that led to a change in the flowering time. And so they were not pollinating at the same time. And so that really became the speciation event. So once these were flowering at different times of the year, they no longer basically had pollen going from one population to another. And so they, even though they were very close together and they were in adjacent habitats, they were genetically isolated because they really weren't reproducing at the same time of year, and so they were no longer exchanging genes with one another. So these plants, again, look very much alike, but we would really consider them separate species because they're no longer sharing genes with one another, even though the genetic changes are pretty subtle here. So again, as we look at evolution then, in terms of the reality of evolution, again, is there evidence for common ancestry? Absolutely. We share all of these genes with one another. We share genes, with the elk and bison and even the aspens and other plants that we find in the Yellowstone ecosystem. So again, we know that there's these shared genes. That means that there's a common ancestry because there's only one way to have shared genes, and that is through a common ancestry. The reality of inheritance is indisputable. The reality of mutations is indisputable. The reality of natural selection is indisputable. Genetic drift, and so on. So again, in terms of actually the evidence, it's overwhelming. Now, as we look in the past, there are other areas and topics that also suggest a common ancestry besides these just slam dunk kind of evidences. And I want to talk a little bit about that and some kind of related topics as well. So one of these is when you look at the fossil record. One thing that we see in the fossil record, and one of the areas where I think that Darwin was off a little bit, Darwin kind of saw evolution as being kind of a slow, deliberate process. But we now know that evolution can be pretty abrupt and dramatic. In plants especially, you can have a speciation event in a single generation, for example. So one of the things we see in the fossil record is what we call punctuated equilibrium. There are a couple of places where we see this, and this usually occurs around extinction events. So for example, if you go back to about 250 million years ago, there were a variety of different types of animals. Actually, amphibians were the dominant land animal at that time. and there was a major extinction event called the Permian extinction. A group of reptiles survived that eventually radiated into a variety of different types of organisms, including all the dinosaurs. This became the age of dinosaurs. And so when we have an extinction event that basically eliminates the competition, this creates opportunity for rapid evolution. So when we have a period of rapid evolution following an extinction event, we refer to this as adaptive radiation. So radiation into a number, or evolution into a number of different varieties from a common ancestor in a short period of time, we refer to as adaptive radiation. So again, we see a rapid change in the fossil record caused by an extinction event, and then rapid evolution into a variety of forms. So the next millions of years in is considered the age of dinosaurs. Dinosaurs dominated during this period of time. And then there was another extinction event about 65, 66 million years ago. The dinosaurs disappear. Mammals are one of the groups that manage to survive, as do birds. And they have a selective advantage in this new world. And they quickly radiate into a variety of different forms. And so, from 66 million years ago to the present, we consider this the age of mammals and birds, for example. So when we see these periods of rapid change relative stability punctuated by rapid change, we refer to this as punctuated equilibrium. So the fossil record isn't necessarily just a slow, gradual change from one type to another. We see massive changes occurring in relatively short periods of time. So we refer to that as punctuated equilibrium. Also, again, I think also looking at the fossil record, I think a lot of people will say that there are no intermediate forms, and that's just not accurate. As you look at transitions between fish and amphibians, transitions from amphibians to reptiles, reptiles to birds, reptiles to mammals, there are a number of transitional forms there. So again, that suggests relatedness. But regardless of all those indirect measures of evolution, we do have the direct measures. And this is something that is just, again, indisputable. Common ancestry because we share genes. There's just no other biological explanation for that. And evolution is the best biological explanation for a common ancestry. All right, that does it today. See you next time.